So several months ago, when we started planning this event, in my mind it was still primarily about creating awareness and discussion here in Europe regarding the grave injustice facing the political prisoners in India and the fascist takeover of India's democratic institutions. Issues that, of course, are at the heart of the incarcerations. We know that European neoliberal governments have been very silent on these issues because of economic and geopolitical interests, but one at least had a little bit of hope that a liberal criticism could be mobilized. But a lot has changed in those months. In India, on the positive side, we've seen that electoral democracy is not dead yet and that people did vote to save the constitution. Here in Europe, meanwhile, with our extreme right government here in the Netherlands aligning with the European trend, it's difficult not to become rather pessimistic about the rise of racist authoritarianism. But even before the recent extreme right victories, we had to witness how our previous liberal prime minister here in the Netherlands actively tried to undermine the International Criminal Court and refused to abide by its ruling to stop export of weapons to a state that most international legal experts agree is committing genocide in Gaza. So in fact, this meeting today has become more of an occasion almost to learn about the collapse of democracy in India in order to learn what we are up against here in Europe. I think there's a lot we can learn from the strategies and endurance of the political prisoners that are at the center of Alpa's book, as well as from Alpa's own role in all of this as a very effective, engaged scholar. A little bit more about the latter. Alpa Shah is, of course, the author of the book we're discussing this evening, and she's professor of social anthropology at the London School of Economics, soon to be taking the chair of the professorship in anthropology at Oxford University. She has a long list of publications, research awards, and distinguished lectures to her name, but let me mention in particular her previous 2019 book, Night March, Amongst India's Revolutionary Guerrillas, as that book is almost something of a prequel to this one. It's a riveting story of Alpa's journey with an active platoon of Naxalites, grounded in her years of living with Adivasi villagers in the area. Night March, just like the Incarcerations, was a finalist for the George Orwell Prize and moreover won the 2020 Association of Political and Legal Anthropology Book Prize in Critical Anthropology. By now it's been translated into 4 different languages. At present, the Incarcerations is making even more of a splash. It was even included in the Financial Times list of what to read in 2024. And in a beautifully coordinated effort, it appeared in bookshops across India, the UK, and North America on March 15th, and is being sold all over the world right now, receiving a lot of critical acclaim. Alpa is being asked to present her book all over Europe, and she just came from a presentation of her book in Paris at the Sciences Po and on French national television. Alpa, it's great to have you here. Shortly about the plan for this evening, Alpa will start with a presentation of about 25 minutes, after which our 2 esteemed discussants will each offer 5 to 10 minutes of reflections. Our discussants are Lisa Dupuy, South Asia correspondent for the major Dutch newspaper, the NRC, and Casper Thomas, editor of the important progressive weekly, De Groene Amsterdammer. After that, after the discussant comments, we'll have 45 minutes for the moderator, that's me, Louisa Stur from the University of Amsterdam, to ask more specific questions and to open the debate to all of you. So without further ado, Alpa, please take the floor.
Thanks so much, Louisa. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. It's a real honor to be amongst you and to tell you very briefly about this book that kind of took over my life for 4.5 years, which during the COVID pandemic, and it began really in a room like this, where we were. In fact, some of you have been with me in a room like this. Some of these pictures are taken at SOAS in London and others at the LSE for a number of years, Jens Lerche and I ran a project looking at Adivasis and Dalits in the underbelly of the Indian economic boom. We had involved in this project lots of amazing people, including Professor Anand Teltumde, who is just here in the bottom corner. We had these are pictures from our final conference. It was a big ERC, European Union funded project, and ESRC, UK government funded project. And we also had invited to this particular occasion, our final conference, Sudha Bhardwaj, who is a labor rights lawyer and trade unionist, to give the keynote. And this was back in 2017, around December 2017. And she said at the time, "I'm really sorry, I'd love to come, but I'm going to have problems with my passport." And I didn't really know what she meant at the time, but I was reading between the lines, and who would have known that a few months later, in April 2018, Anand Teltumde, Sudha Bhardwaj, and a whole range of other people who I've known, I guess many of whom I've known over the course of my own research and scholarship in India, were going to be raided. The police of one single city, Pune, in western India, was going to come to their doorstep almost simultaneously and take over their computers, their electronic devices, the USB keys. Actually, that's all they were interested in. And a few months later, some of these people who were raided would find themselves in prison in Pune. They were taken there under anti-terror laws, draconian anti-terror laws that India has, called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under which they can simply imprison you with somebody having made a complaint and with no evidence. And then you can stay in prison, like most of these people, the BK16 are, the group of scholars and activists who got arrested. And six years on, many of them are still in prison. So this law can be used to incarcerate people without any evidence, with no chance of a trial, there's no sign of a trial 6 years on. And the whole point of this incarceration is that the process of incarceration is the punishment. And it's a big message to, it's basically to silence you and to silence everybody who is doing work like you, to silence your family, to basically strike fear in everybody doing the kind of work that they were doing, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And so the conviction rates, by the way, under this law are less than 2.3%. So it's like it's if the case ever comes to trial. Okay, so Anand Teltumde also found himself raided. Over the next few years, what happened is 16 people found themselves incarcerated, all framed in this one case, and they were incarcerated in Pune and then sent during the COVID pandemic to two jails, women to the jail in the Baikula prison in Mumbai and men to Taloja jail. And that is where many of them still remain. So I'm just going to kind of quickly run through the bare bones of this case. So what happened is when maybe around 2021, when a particular individual called Stan Swami, who was a Jesuit priest who had been working in the state of Jharkhand for 30 years fighting for the rights of indigenous people. When he was incarcerated, he was 83 years old when he was incarcerated. He had severe Parkinson's disease. And when he was sent to prison, the editor of my book, Night March, that Louisa mentioned, my Indian editor, I had different editors in different countries, he basically said to me, "We really need a book on this case. I know how to keep hope alive. It's to make books possible, books that make a difference. We really need a book on this case, and you're the person to write it. Please, will you consider?" And I obviously have been cursing this editor ever since because he put this responsibility on my shoulders, a responsibility that I at the time, I had a 2-year-old daughter, and everybody was in very difficult circumstances under COVID. We were in a particularly difficult circumstance. University workloads had tripled overnight, and I couldn't breathe. And I was like, how can you ask me to write a book in these circumstances? I thought I'd write a quick book when I eventually committed to it. I committed to it when Stan Swamy actually died in judicial custody 6 months later. And it just had become such a huge, just such a shocking story. I thought I'd write a fast book, 60,000 words, and I'd tell the story of these incarcerated activists and who they were and why they were so dangerous, so to speak, dangerous. But 4.5 years later, this book turned into a mammoth beast that you see now, because I realized that actually the case in which they were incarcerated told a very shocking story of the collapse of democracy in the world's largest democracy. It told a story about the rise of authoritarianism and the weapons of authoritarianism, which has kind of global resonance, and I'll be sharing some of that with you. And so this, this book became bigger and bigger and bigger, and here we are today. So there were 16 people incarcerated in this case, and I'm just going to tell you briefly something about them to tell you why they were so dangerous. And they were picked up, really from different parts of the country. This was like another shocking thing. It was like literally the Pune police going to all over the country, picking people up and framing them in this case. And they were framed in a case of inciting violence in a place called Bhima Koregaon. You'll see it there in the top left-hand corner, in the state of Maharashtra. It was a place that many of them had never even heard of. Stan Swamy, when his lawyer told him that he was involved in this case because he was involved in inciting violence in this place called Bhima Koregaon. He's like, Bhima Koregaon? Where is this? He didn't know where Bhima Koregaon was. And this is the amazing police who went about incarcerating these people. What they did is, remember I told you that they had taken their computers and all their electronic devices. They said that they had found on these electronic devices letters and documents which showed that they were terrorists. They were Maoist terrorists, Naxalites. And, India has a long-standing 50-year-old underground armed left-wing insurgency, which the government has said is a terrorist movement. And so, and those people who are said to have links with this movement can be imprisoned under these anti-terror laws. So they flashed around after having put the first lot of the imprisoned activists in jail. They flashed these letters around all across the national news channels. And most of the mainstream news channels at this point, except for one, had been completely complicit with the Modi regime, had been bought over by the big corporate houses that is complicit with the Modi regime. And so all the big news channels across the country flashed all these stories about how the Pune police had found these terrorists who were not just in the remote forests of India, but now were in the cities, were everywhere. They might be wearing nice little bags, jolas, those cotton bags, but actually, and they might be wearing nice clothes, but they were all terrorists. And so they went around flashing these letters. One of these letters, they said, showed a plot to assassinate Prime Minister Modi. Okay, this letter, really interesting letter. So this was sent all over the media. So, of course, I got a copy of this as well back in London. And I was looking at this, and it was just such a strange letter. They said that this was written by Maoists, and that it was discussing the sale of weapons, and that it discussed also a plot to assassinate Prime Minister Modi. And anybody who has done serious research amongst the actual guerrillas, which I had done previously, as Louisa mentioned, knows that the Maoists never write letters like this. They never use real people's names. They never even use the names of weapons in letters. Everything has a pseudonym. So it just didn't make any sense that such a letter could even exist, right? And so I was not the only one who was suspicious about this. Top security analysts in India actually already raised concerns about this. The Caravan magazine saw this and started to analyze these letters. And what's Sorry, I'll keep on those letters for a moment. And they already started saying that there's something very dodgy about these letters. As time transpired, it has emerged that these letters were implanted on the computers of the people that had been arrested. And this has been done by some of the top digital forensic companies in the world who are based in the US, who got the clone copies taken by the Pune police and who sent them for cyber forensic analysis to the US. And these cyber forensic consultants, so I have a huge chapter. I never expected to be learning anything about cyber warfare. I can barely type a Word document on my computer. But there are some amazing people out there in the US who are these cyber pros, and they decided that they were going to talk to me about what they found. And what they revealed was shocking to them as well. They had not seen a case in which not only had evidence been, people's computers had been hacked, people's mobile phones had been hacked. You might have heard of the whole Pegasus scandal with, Israeli spyware being used to target journalists across the world. So this, all of these people were targeted by Pegasus, but they had malware put on their computers, which enabled people who then got control of their computers, you could call them hackers, to implant evidence on their computers. Interestingly, this letter, this alleged letter of a Modi assassination plot, never appeared in the charge sheets of this case. And there are people in this room I know who are cyber forensic experts who are interested in this case purely because it is so extraordinary in global terms. But it also shows what actually could be happening in many parts of the world, the new weapons of authoritarian regimes. Okay, so apart from these letters, what they also said was that, remember I said that the BK16 had incited violence. So where had they incited violence? So what the book traces is that what actually happened at this place where all this violence existed. So on the 1st of January 2018, Dalits, who are India's, previously untouchable castes, who are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, have for decades been celebrating the 1st of January 2018 at this place, Bhima Koregaon. Bhima Koregaon is a very interesting place because there is a British War Memorial set on the banks of the river Bhima there. That British War Memorial actually celebrates the last battle of the British Army at Koregaon 200 years before, so in 1818, which enabled the British to fight the upper caste Peshawar Empire and gain control of that major section of northern India, which basically enabled them to establish and consolidate British colonial rule over India. Now, Dalits, interestingly, started celebrating this battle of the British as their own battle that they had won over upper castes in India. And so, remember the British regiments, like all of these colonial regiments, always had native forces in them. So the Dalits were a big force. There was the Maha regiment of the Dalits, which was a big part of the British Army. And so when you go to Bhima Koregaon and you look at this obelisk at Bhima Koregaon, what you see at the obelisk, so I've got a picture of the obelisk, there it is, you see all these plaques, like you see one of them there. And on those plaques are the names of all the soldiers who died at this place. And on those plaques are the names of all these Mahar Dalits who died. So the Dalits started celebrating this as their victory over upper castes in India. And so from many years ago, the Hindutva, so this is the Hindutva forces are basically, this 100-year-old organization that has been working to create India into a Hindu, majoritarian Hindu nationalist state, which excludes its kind of 200 million Muslim minority. So there has been this 100-year-old, they'll celebrate 100 years next year, this 100-year-old movement, which over the last 10 years really got consolidation of forces across India through the election of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India back in 2014, and then 2019. Now he's just recently won the last election for a third term in power. So the Hindutva forces had for years been saying Dalits should not be celebrating this battle because it divides Indians. That in Golwarkar, their ideologue, one of the main ideologues of Hindutva forces, has a whole section in his bunch of thoughts on how this battle should not be celebrated. So on the 1st of January 2018, what happened here at Bhima Koregaon was that the Dalits who were gathering there for the 200th year anniversary celebrations found themselves attacked. And they were attacked by men with saffron flags, and they were attacked by, their cars were attacked. People had rocks thrown at them from rooftops, and they were basically told to stop celebrating this battle, to go back home. And as a result of this violence, one person died. And so remember, it's the Hindutva men on the streets who are attacking the Dalits. And as a result of this, one person eventually, one of the instigators of these riots, a man called Milan Dekpore, who is down in the picture there, but there's also another guy in the middle there, Sambhaji Bhire. These were the main instigators of the riots. I don't know if any of you have read Paul Brass's brilliant work, but he looks at how, riots have these riot instigators who are out there basically making those riots happen over a long period of time. And so these two men were accused by a Dalit activist who I interview at length in the book. So the book exposes exactly what happened in this riots according to, the Dalit activists on the ground. And she filed an FIR against these two men, Anita Savale, her name is, and this guy found himself in prison. A month later, he was out of prison, and suddenly the Pune police went around the country and said it was all of these people, the BK16, the intellectuals that the book focuses on, who were actually the instigators of that violence. Many of whom, like Stan Swami, had not even heard about Bhima Koregaon. Okay. So who are these people who were incarcerated? And I'm just going to give you a very quick tour of who they were. Sudha Bharadwaj, who I already mentioned, actually was born in the U.S., had U.S. citizenship, gave it up at the age of 23 to live with the miners of Chhattisgarh, worked amongst informal labor, mobilizing as a trade unionist with a man called Shankar Guhan Yogi. Notoriously in India, most informal labor is not mobilized, it doesn't have unions to represent them. Sudha Bharadwaj is at the forefront of labor mobilization. At the age of 40, she decided that she had to widen her work because not only labor rights are important, but also the fight against the mining corporations who were taking over the lands of indigenous people in the areas where she worked. So she trained as a lawyer, and she was fighting both the labor rights cases, but she also started to expand her work onto the police atrocities against Adivasis in central and eastern India, where major counterinsurgency operations have been ongoing since 2006. Many indigenous people thrown into the prisons of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and many killed in encounters which are revealed by people like Sudha and others incarcerated in this case to be fake, and they show that children are killed in some of these encounters. So people like Sudha were basically fighting the big mining operations and the state counterinsurgency forces in these areas, and they were deeply rooted in the social movements on the ground, and they had national and international national reach, so they could bring the stories of what's happening in these far corners of the country that people were not reporting on. It was really hard to work in, and they could bring them to a national audience, but also sometimes an international audience. So we have people like Sudha Bhardwaj, Stan Swami, doing similar kinds of work in Jharkhand, who I already mentioned, the Jesuit priest, using the Indian constitution creatively to read the constitution and think, okay, we can use that part of the constitution to have this kind of a struggle against, the mining corporations taking over the soil underneath Adivasi land. So, really, really creative, really intelligent, really brilliant people who are, all intellectuals in their own right. And many were actually writing books. Let's see, Surendra Gadling, a Dalit lawyer working in the state of Maharashtra, doing similar kind of work to Sudha Bhardwaj, had inspired many, many Dalit lawyers on the ground in India, which is also something very unusual as well, So these are inspirational people. Sudha Bhardwaj inspired many women lawyers to come and join her in Chhattisgarh, a state very hard to work in. She had gathered a whole load of women lawyers doing similar kinds of work. Similarly, Surendra Gadling mobilized Dalit lawyers. Mahesh Raut, a 31-year-old forest rights activist, a student who'd just come out of, some of India's best institutions and was going to work amongst the Adivasis, fighting off one of the big iron ore companies in those areas. Rona Wilson, a prisoners' rights activist, a researcher at Delhi University. Arun Ferreira and Vernon Gonzalez, again, long-term activists, writers, a brilliant cartoonist, Arun Ferreira. The two of them were writing a column in a magazine, in an internet publication called Daily O, where Arun Ferreira, they were friends. Arun Ferreira would do the drawings, and Vernon would do the political commentary. And so, just before they were arrested, that's what they were doing. Shoma Sen, head of English at Nagpur University, women's rights activist. Hani Babu, a professor of English, an associate professor of English at Delhi University. So for this book, I dive deep into their work. So the book is got these biographical accounts of them, and it really tries to understand them as both people, but also their scholarship. And with Hani Babu, I couldn't understand most of his work. It was on these erudite notions of syntax in English literature. But he had also written these occasional brilliant articles in Economic and Political Weekly, where he basically argues that in India, actually the language of decolonization is English, not Hindi, because Hindi is the language of the upper castes, and actually, the language that unites all the lower castes is English. So there's really kind of counterintuitive arguments, really very, just shows his brilliance. Anantal Tumde, I already talked about, written, I can't count how many books he has written on caste, on Hindutva, on neoliberalism, in my mind is probably one of the most important anthropologists of caste in the world. So this picture is actually taken at the LSE. He is his wife there on the right is Rama Ambedkar. She is the wife. She's the granddaughter of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who drafted the Indian Constitution. The reason why they are at the LSE is because there's a bust of Dr. Ambedkar there, which they'd gone to Garland because he was an LSE alumni. Jyoti Jagtap, Ramesh Gaichor and Sagar Gorkhe. So what you find in this case is people from all kinds of backgrounds. So you have really people from a very elite background, like Sudha Bhardwaj, who are imprisoned, but you also have people like Jyoti, Ramesh and Sagar, who have grown up in the slums of Pune and who have been these incredible, bards. They were poets, cultural, poets who were singing songs in the neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods of Maharashtra, and bringing loads of people, thousands of people would gather to listen to their songs, and they were singing against caste oppression. And importantly, what you see in this case is all of these people were not only fighting caste oppression, but they were also fighting the kind of processes of global capitalism that they think are also important in analyzing why Dalits and why Adivasis remain oppressed in the country. So this was a very particular critique of caste of the country taking place, which was not only critiquing both the caste oppression, but also and the state oppression, but also taking on big capital. And here we have Sudhir Tavale, a Dalit poet and publisher. Varvara Rao, a very well-known revolutionary poet from the state of Andhra Pradesh. We have Gautam Navlakha, who was my friend, actually. He for 30 years, he was a journalist of the Economic and Political Weekly. And he was one of the people who really went into the state of Kashmir in the early 90s to show the atrocities, the human rights atrocities taking place in Kashmir before most people, within the country got interested in Kashmir. So, and then he also went to the Adivasi areas of central and eastern India, showing exactly the abuse of the state counterinsurgency forces in those areas. So he found himself imprisoned. Okay, so just very quickly to run through why they were so dangerous, which I've already kind of talked to you about. They were creating this kind of cross, so all of them were arguing not on an identity-based politics. They were arguing that we have to unite across different caste groups, across different class groups, and we have to have an anti-caste alliance, and we have to fight off the inequalities and injustices, both coming through us from the state, but also through its nexus with capital. They were fighting against the mining corporations, trying to take over indigenous land, and they were outright against the ostracization of particular communities, in this case, Muslims. They were uniting and creating alliances between different kinds of struggles. So, as I said, with Sudha Bharadwaj, there was a labor rights movement. There was the movement against mining corporations. And she had actually, just before she was imprisoned, had gone to Kashmir to look at the abuses of human rights lawyers in Kashmir. So many of them had gone out on a mission to Kashmir to look at what the human rights lawyers in Kashmir were facing, the repression they were facing, and that report couldn't get published because they all got incarcerated in this case. So they were intellectuals and activists at the same time, and they had this kind of versatility of contributions. They were all writers, they were all thinkers, but they were also deeply embedded in social movements on the ground and could reach from the grassroots to the national and sometimes the global. So now India, as many of you will know, has this rich tradition of democratic rights activists, people like the BK16 who are everywhere across the country. And I think, silencing and targeting the BK16 in this way was a strong message to all such democratic rights activists across the country that, be careful or you're next. It was a very, very strong message. And, they don't belong to any political parties. They're not paid by NGOs. All they have is their labor, and their persistence and their sacrifice of their lives to do this work. And what we see in this case and what the book charts is basically the ingredients of the rise of this authoritarian fascist regime, which I found extremely interesting and never expected to cover. The growth of the masses, the vigilantes on the ground who are ready to police people into line. We have the rise of lynchings across India in the last 10 years. And what you see in the in the riots at Bhima Koregaon is an example of this. Mobs taking to the street to police people without even orders having necessarily been given from very high above. It's like you have also the whole idea of this creation of a mythic past and the production of a superhuman race. And that was the objection to why these Bhima Koregaon celebrations shouldn't be happening. It stops the unity of India. We need to create this kind of powerful Hindu race. You have the protection of the regime, which is supporters, which is basically the whole. So what you see in this case is a whole very partial police force, and what a big part of the book uncovers is how the hacking happened, how the how the evidence was implanted on their computers, and you see the whole role of the police emerging through it. I won't give away the spoilers. It's like a thriller. I mean, there's parts of this book are just like, it's because I was like sitting on the edge of my seat discovering these things, and really didn't expect to find what I found. The new weapons of cyber warfare, very, very, very important. The capture of the state institutions. The judiciary has behaved in extraordinary ways in this case. I can tell you more during Q&A about this, but you see the collapse of the judiciary through this case, and the domination and the complicity of the media, which I briefly touched on right at the beginning. And the close pact of the reciprocity with corporate capital, right? And also, what you see is the complicity of international governments and communities, and I can elaborate on that later if you want. But yeah, that's the end for now. Thank you so much.
Join us and offer your comments to start off the discussion. Lisa, do you want to start?
Yes.
We have some mics here.
Okay. Yes, I want to start by a clear disclaimer that I'm by far, I'm sure, in this entire room, the person with the least experience of thinking on India. But I've been a correspondent in that country for 2.5 years. And I picked up the book, as Louisa rightly just explained. It was, all of a sudden, it appeared in every single bookshop that I could ever hope to visit in Delhi. And I see quite a lot of bookshops because I'm very often in airports. Going from one place to another in India or in the rest of South Asia. That's why I picked up the Incarcerations. And I looked at it and thought, oh, this sounds like it would sort of describe a blueprint of India as a country whose democracy is backsliding. That has sort of been an umbrella theme to a lot of my being a correspondent over the last 2.5 years. And I've noticed now when I say to my editors, this is what I'm looking at, it feels like the space for activism and for open debate is shrinking in this country. My editors now take a statement like that. We've used democratic backsliding in headers to my pieces. But I did wonder, well, that's a very difficult sort of mechanism to grasp, and that the book goes, as you say, it's 2018, 2020, these the rates and then the incarcerations. I figured, this book will give me this background. Is this maybe the first steps to where the backsliding starts that I'm now at the receiving end of? And then there is a couple of very interesting and scary plot twists. The repetition of which I've also now experienced. I'm someone that works with local journalists, quite a few who have been with NewsClick, for instance, we are now in a constant state of twisting ourselves to say, can we actually work together on this story? Do I risk bringing more of a danger to colleagues that have been flagged in the NewsClick case? So NewsClick being a fiercely independent news organization in India that earlier this year has had basically all of its contributors and people on staff also raided. USBs taken, laptops taken, and we're just still sitting at the edge of our seats to figure out if there will be outcomes to these actions by the state. And so while I was reading the book, it provided me with some very concrete, fleshed out, in a lot of ways very personal context to what it feels like to see a country's democracy lose grip with people, or the other way around. As well as very concrete echoes or blueprints to things that I was experiencing or have been experiencing over the last 2.5 years. One very important one is actually, you put it at the top of the page and it just sparked this growth of the masses that take on the dominant sides or the dominant state's color. Literally, at this case, in India with the saffronization, I've noticed a lot of debate, especially in light of the recent election results, to say, there's a little bit of light here. These results are not 100% as we expected them to be. There seems to be at least opposition and at least dissent might gain some ground again. The question is how long for? And to me, the question is also, well, that might play out in Delhi, that may play out when it comes to sort of this paper framework of what a state is. Meanwhile, we have a society that over the last 10 years, and if we wanted to take on Mr. Modi's time in Gujarat over the last 20 years maybe, a society that has become completely saturated and completely used to some very violent expressions of the Hindutva ideology, and where vigilantes no longer are halted by the state, where indeed the judiciary, but especially what I find when I speak to people, very, very impressive in a negative way, people's conformity and their comfort with making their neighbors into second-class citizens, or blaming urban nexals or other nexals for ills that they see in society. So this societal saturation with a very violent ideology that is anti-democratic, that paints the other as always anti-national, as always an insurgent, that has been very striking. And it shows, if these stalwarts of democracy, or the bastions of democracy, as Alpa describes them, if they can be picked up, and that means that everybody else is also under the same pressure. And so I think the book in itself, gives a great, sadly, a great description of how that could happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll pick up where Lisa also left off. For me, your book, Alpa, has been insightful on many levels. In particular, I've been a correspondent in India in the years leading up to the first election of Modi in 2014. I've been following the developments intermittently, going back to cover elections intermittently. And something I've noticed, how increasingly rare it has become to actually read a story like this. I think under relatively normal circumstances, or say pre-2014 circumstances, there would have been a lot more investigative journalism. The whole media climate would have been much more open. So, stories like these would just rise to the surface more. And that's why I appreciate your book very much, and I was so happy reading it. And that's why I'm a new ambassador for the book, and would endorse it to read it to everybody. Is that it sheds light on something that's deliberately being kept in the dark, of course, because this is the story about India that the current powers do not want to have told. And although it's very specific for India, of course, I think many of the points you make apply to democracy and in a wider sense, and not just in India, but globally. I mean, the ways that democracies get eroded, or the way authoritarian regimes consolidate themselves, all seem to follow more or less the same script. The use of vigilante mobs is one, but specifically also sort of the discourse that these mobs maybe rely on, the whole idea of separating up the people in a country between national and anti-national. I think that is the most pungent point, that is the whole basis of it. And this has become such a strong political instrument, and you see that everywhere, that distinction is being made. And authoritarian leaders, or aspiring authoritarian leaders in more strong democracies at the moment, they look at each other's playbooks. They know which language works, they know which methods work, if they want to suppress dissent. So that makes it even more important for sort of the counter public to understand how these methods are used. I've in my writings I've spoken of like an anti-liberal international, which is maybe something equivalent to a liberal international, like in the NGOs, media, etc. All these organizations work together globally to support human rights, to support democracy, but the opposite is also happening, and you see that happening more and more, is that the anti-liberal, the authoritarian and anti-democratic forces start joining hands and essentially explain or trading sort of tips and secrets on how to suppress dissent. And it really boils down to the point, and I think that again is a very India-specific point and a global point at the same time, that democracy is so much more than voting and the process of casting the ballot and transforming the results into a representative government. And even on that level, I think the label democracy is still relatively strong in India. It's the whole extra set of things that makes a democracy actually vibrant and livable for all citizens, and that comes with freedom of the press, freedom to organize, the freedom to dissent, the freedom to and all these things. And that specifically, that element is of course the one that's been under threat so much. And what strikes me, and for me, reading your book, and that's why it's. You work as an academic, but I say this is. I would also label this as a piece of investigative journalism, in the sense that it really delves out a very specific case of how a democracy strays from its own ideals and gives it names and faces, and I think you did that very deliberately because that really drives home the point. And like I say, those stories should be told more, and they're rare. And at the end of the book, you really use the BKA 16 case as a pars pro toto for a wider story of what's going on in democracy in India. And you raise the point of complicity, and I find that a very interesting and also very thorny subject. I mean, you say, international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, they give India gradings, and in that way they sort of prop up the economy. It's international leaders that shake the hands with Modi on the global stage. With every handshake, the political power that at the end of the pyramid, of course, is behind the incarcerations that you describe becomes stronger. And I think this is something for discussion also. But it goes maybe even further. I mean, the tourist who spends his money and ends up in the wrong pockets, is there an element of complicity there? It's to what extent, does this, how far does this go? And this does, again, it's not just an India specific question. It's something that goes for many regimes in the world at the moment. So I think I'm happy you sort of opened that discussion in your book. Also, at the same time, I was very struck with again seeing the Modi assassination letter. I was covering the previous in the India elections just now, and I impromptu went to one Modi rally in Mysore. I didn't even have a proper press card. I had a journalist accreditation for I mean, the security level at that particular rally was so low that reading that letter made it quite laughable. I mean, it was so. Just goes to show. And at the same time, I mean, coming out of those elections, the good thing is there still seems to be a corrective effect with the ballot box. It's always difficult to really peter out what exactly explains one particular election result. I do think the unfulfilled promises and suppression of certain communities, the ones that you also discuss in your book, do play a role in the fact that the Hindutva flame of the BJP seems to be burning slightly less strongly after this election than it did before. At the same time, what really strikes me in my time frame in India, as I said, is really the past 10 years, is how quickly it goes. I mean, this is 10 years is one new generation of young people who grow up in a country, or one generation of students. And if they've all missed the more open, more plural, say, media environment of those days, like it becomes really small. So those are my thoughts and comments.
Thanks so much. Shall I pick up on a few issues and phrase them as a question to Alpa before opening up? Because, you two touched on a few issues. First of all, this anti-liberal playbook, this authoritarian playbook. One of the things that struck me in the book was, of course, here in Europe, we have a lot of conspiracy theories circulating amongst the extreme right. But your book is about an actual, real, very systematically planned extreme right conspiracy. How much is that part of the playbook? Is one of the things I wonder about. Another thing, when you talk about complicity, of course, at universities here, we're having a lot of discussion in the context of the student protest for Palestine about rethinking university relationships with third parties. And I'm just curious whether you know if there's ties to Indian academic institutions that make us complicit in things like, well, the human rights violations against Muslim citizens interned in Assam, or the grave, killings and encounters on Adivasis defending themselves against mining, or of course the colonization of Kashmir. How is it with Indian academic institutions? Do they enjoy relative academic freedom and critical distance from the regime still, or what's going on there? Do they need to be taken on board in this discussion? And then finally, something perhaps others in the room will also be wondering about. One of the first things after the election, which of course had some rays of light, was that Arundhati Roy was put under the notorious Unlawful Activity Prevention Act that you talk about so much in your book. Any ideas where that case might be going in light of what we know here?
Lots of questions. I'll try to be brief. I'm sure I won't be able to respond to everything, but I think first I just wanted to say thanks to Lisa and to Casper for being here on this panel. And I think one of the things I should say is that I wouldn't have been able to write this book were it not for the extraordinary work of the brave journalists that have covered, Indian journalists that have covered, little different parts of this story. So, mainstream media has been completely taken over, especially with the collapse of the last remaining news channel, NDTV. But there are these independent, all these journalists, these brilliant journalists India had, they all set up independent, news channels, YouTube channels, working for, these wonderful internet, media outfits, and I wouldn't have been able to do this work without them. But one thing that my editor said to me, who asked me to write the book, was, there's no one in India who can put the whole story together, who can actually tackle the whole thing, because they're going after everybody who's taking this case seriously. You're outside of India, you can afford to write this book, so you have to consider this, And so I think there's two sides to this. One is the incredible work that is going on, despite the repression, but also the extreme repression that is faced by journalists. NewsClick, Gautam Navlakha, for the last 2 years of before he went to prison, was working for NewsClick. And then they went after NewsClick, the main guys of NewsClick, and you see that in the education sector as well, of course, So one of the reasons why I could write this book, and maybe an Indian academic couldn't do so in the same way, is because of the repression that Indian academics are under. We know of not just the academics, but also students, and we see this same playbook of how people have been framed and incarcerated, used against all those students who basically protested against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time in Indian history discriminated against Muslims. And in 2019 there were these big protests across Indian campuses, and especially in Delhi, where there was a big protest city set up, led by students from Jamia Millia University, from JNU, and also by Muslim women from the local neighborhoods. And then a little while later, this protest city was basically COVID took place, so they had to kind of shut down. But then there were these riots in Delhi, which were basically in northern Delhi, and they were against Muslims. And who was it who was implicated in this violence? It was those students who had been protesting at Jamia Millia and Delhi University, and it's a very similar kind of framings taking place. And now most of the students are still under the same laws incarcerated. And when you see a continuation of that happening, and extreme repression of academics, people leaving the country because it's freer for them to speak outside of country. That means control of staff appointments, vice chancellors on universities handpicked by the RSS. And I think this is where I don't have as much hope as you kind of maybe suggested maybe after 10 years we will get a new generation of students. But what we have to realize about the Indian authoritarian rise is that this 100-year history of organizational work on the ground in far corners of the country. And it's a kind of organization that I don't think we have parallels with here in the West, you know. And you know, so what I mean by that, I mean, those of you who are new to the RSS or the workings of Hindutva, is, you know, they have labor unions, they have agricultural unions, they have they have presence everywhere. They have student movements in the university campuses, and importantly, they have set up schools across the Indian countryside in places like the Adivasi areas where I worked, where, you know, when I first started working there, literacy rates were like 93%. Now, Adivasis, who are kind of much more egalitarian compared to the rest of Indian society, they send their children to schools. Which schools do they send them to? They send them to the RSS schools, not because they're RSS schools, but because they're the only schools around that actually have teachers in them. And, you know, and through that there is a slow process that has taken place where you have a whole new generation of youth that is being brought up in those schools with textbooks rewritten to present Indian history in particular light, to demonize the Mughal periods, to demonize Muslims, to project a particular idea of Hinduism, of what it means to be a patriot or a national. And you know, they've been raised on this. So we have generations of youth who are out there, and youth who are out there on the streets with their daggers and their trishul and their, you know, pistols, who are willing to police people, morally police people they think are stepping out of line. So Muslims who they think are taking over Hindu women or have taken over Hindu land, or Dalits who they think are, you know, trading in cows, or you know. So, and we have seen this, a rise of lynchings, people lynched to death 2 days after the elections. What did we have in the state of Chhattisgarh? A truck was going past in the middle of the night with buffalo. The truck was attacked. And it was attacked, and the 2 truckers were lynched to death and thrown, you know, across a bridge. And it was because they were carrying cattle, you know, 2 days after the election results. The election results, you know, you talk about Arundhati Roy, and, you know, a few days later, I mean, last Friday, we had, the Lieutenant General of Delhi say that the same law, the UAPA, that has been used to incarcerate the BK-16, can be used to incarcerate her. Like, she can be, you know, she can be prosecuted for something she said like 14 years before at a conference, you know, conference like this in Delhi. I mean, a conference on issues of Kashmir, where there had been intense counterinsurgency in Kashmir, a lot of human rights repression, and she had said Kashmir has never been integral to India. And, you know, this is a position that's held by many, many democratic rights activists in the country, and whether you agree with it or not, she just said it was a speech she delivered, you know, in a conference, and she could be prosecuted for that speech and imprisoned under these anti-terror laws. Whether they'll actually do that or not is a different matter, but it is a very strong message to everybody who is celebrating after the election, saying, oh, we have a more moderate Modi back in power. No, we don't, you know. They're there to show that actually we are stronger and we will, you know, go for you, no matter who you are. If you, you know, and that's what the message is. Like, you go after India's like most celebrated writer, somebody who is well known internationally. And it's a strong message to all those critiques of the Modi regime who suddenly got, you know, like, okay, we can speak now. But also to a strong message to his own supporters who are that, don't worry, we didn't get the majority, you know, that we wanted, but actually we're back stronger than ever. But I want to end on a different note, which is to say that, you know, last week I was with a whole load of Indian journalists, you know, from all these independent news channels, and, you know, what they were saying, which I, you know, agree with, is that now is the moment where we have to unite forces, where we actually have to, you know, really show what is at stake, where we show, you know, continue doing the good work. And I think in that context, what we are doing internationally is extremely important. So it's a real privilege to have both of you on this panel, you know, in Amsterdam, working for the papers that you're working for, covering these hidden stories and, you know, stories that are being and will continue to be repressed in India. But this is a moment when I think we really do have hope to organize and to fight back and to keep open those spaces of democracy, which matter not just for India, but for the world. Thank you.
Let me open to the audience. Please shortly state your name before beginning your question.
Hi, my name is Madhur. I have two questions, one for Alpa and one for the two of you. Do you think that it's something that I've struggled with for a while, but do you think that democracy in India has been a bit of a blip? Because I read Land Guns Caste Women and Sujata Gitla's Ants Amongst Elephants, which talked about sort of the lives of Dalits and how the Indian state has always been very inherently oppressive. So I sometimes struggle with the question of democracy for who? Because there's show, we had a workshop yesterday where we were talking about elite commitment to democracy and how it might be decreasing, but as you show that there's a lot of commitment from a grassroots level to democracy, but has elite commitment always been sort of for show or, so just kind of, are we just sort of going back or are we really just showing our true colors in terms of democracy? Because we've always been quite oppressive towards Dalits and Adivasis and such, and now it's just extending towards Muslims and other minorities. And for the two of you, is it hard to work, or do you feel like you have to censor yourself? Because I know, for example, the BBC, I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but they kind of had to sell or, pull out from India in the sense that they no longer control BBC India, and they kind of subsidized it and sold it to former colleagues who worked at the BBC. So because of, obviously, they released a documentary and then they were raided and et cetera, et cetera. So do you also feel, or have you experienced pressure, and what do you think the future is for foreign correspondents? Because obviously Indian correspondents are anyway in a severe disadvantage. So if we also now have started putting a lot of pressure on foreign correspondents, which we obviously have also in terms of OCI Indian citizens or OCI cardholders, they've also their passes have also been revoked recently. So just kind of what your thoughts were on that.
Thanks so much. Shall I collect 2 or 3 more questions before we continue?
Thank you. My first comment is to Alpa. Thanks for the book and for the warnings, for the signals sent out. And for pointing out the global connectivity of what's happening, what has transpired in India. And of course, Modi is centerpiece. I don't know if in your book, I have not been able to yet to read it, but if in your book also Amit Shah crops up as the sidekick and hatchetman of Modi, in charge of the dirty tricks department. A very evil man, and his connectivity to the global sphere of cyber warfare is very important. But my main comment is to the two discussants who have followed the elections in India. And I've read their pieces in the NRC and in the Groene. I've also commented on it. They did not smell what was transpiring in India. They did not smell because they were taken along by the campaign of BJP. And in their predictions, they had counterpoints, no doubt about that. But in their predictions, they expected a glorious triumph of Modi, as many did in India. Not all. And the dissenting voices were not picked up. And I think we owe a tribute to these 16 people because they have paved the way to the change of mindset not in the media yet, not in the judiciary, not in the state institutions, but at the local level, that the emperor has no power, has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes, and we don't believe is godlike avatar. We have the changing mood is very important, and it is not yet reflected in the voting power, because it seems as if BJP has gained in the global in South India, but in the hard belt, he has lost. And if he has not lost more, it's because he handled the state machinery and saw to it that people did not vote, opted out, because they got a message, get out or get killed. That's how candidates were removed from the scene throughout the northern belt. They could not do that in South India, but they could do it in North India. And it is important because we are facing a situation in the Netherlands, not of a Modi, come on, but of a rightist backlash. Not to be alert to that danger, to that fascism, should also be a reason to read the book and to think of the people who stood up and confronted the BJP in their local situation, because the popular mood has changed in India.
Thank you very much for these pertinent comments by Professor Breman. He did not introduce himself, but one more question.
Hi, thank you for sharing this book and writing this book and sharing it with us. My name is Aditya, and I have a very specific question for Alpa. In a week from now, actually, I think on July 1st, Amit Shah's changes to the Indian Penal Code are supposed to come in. And my understanding has been from the discussions going around it, it's going to be much more draconian in its ambiguity. And specifically for the UAPA, it has implications because now very low-level police officials can actually file UAPA cases, if I'm correct. So what do you, given that you've engaged with this law so much, what do you make of this and the implications of that? And what could be any hopeful opportunities for people to work with that? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's have a round of answers and hopefully keep it a little bit short because I think there's more people in the audiences. Alpa, do you want to start? No. Lisa? Okay.
Did you want to divide questions or are we both?
No.
Okay. I'll go last to first because that's how you remember these things. I think you're correct to an extent to say that some of these changing sentiments, they're hard to pick on or to pick up. Also because I think I've thought a lot about this after the elections. I spent a good amount of time in Gujarat first because I thought, actually the phenomenon of Modi, I'm not sure that my newspaper has carried him, we've painted him correctly.
You know what happened in Gandhinagar, in Amit Shah?
No, absolutely.
Do you know what happened in
I do. Okay. I am aware of what happened in these different constituencies. You read it, you kind of try and log it in the back of your head, and you hope that you're intelligent enough to at some point be able to make a quirk about it in the big piece or whatever. I mean, it's a big country. It's a difficult thing to explain. So I do think it was maybe easier, maybe too easy to say, let's focus on raising the alarm. Let's focus on illustrating what's really bad or what might be coming that's really bad. I will say you do look out for voices of dissent, but even then, I think in writing down what it is that they say, it's easier sometimes to take over their message that is an alarm or that is an alarmist message. So I did write this in my piece on the inauguration of Modi 3.0. I did say, and I've heard this for 2.5 years. People have told me the refrain was, "It will get worse. It will get worse. It will get worse." I would speak to human rights lawyers, and they would say, "It will get worse." I would speak to. I live in Nizamuddin East in New Delhi. There's been. For a year, I've tracked several religious teachers who take care of shrines around Nizamuddin East, who continue on being demolished. And every time something happens, I'll go and visit them, and I chat to them, and I say what's happened, and it'll be an unlawful police action, or it'll be bulldozers, the famous bulldozer democracy that we've seen take place. And they will tell me, "Oh, it will get worse. G20 will come around. Modi wants no dissent. It will get worse. The elections are coming up. There will be a very strong Hindutva campaign. It'll get worse." And I do think, to an extent, it's been easier to paint that picture. And sometimes, you're one person trying to cover something that happens to 1.3 billion people. It gets drowned out. I wanted to quickly tell you, is it difficult for journalists to work? Yes, there's pressure. There's also a strange absence of pressure, in the sense that I've been here for, let's say, close to 3 years. I've yet to speak to a government official. Apart from those officials in the Ministry of External Affairs, who are the people that will or will not grant me a visa. Which is always interesting, conversations behind closed doors. It's maybe different for Dutch media, because there's no debate that can be sparked off of our content, hardly in a debate in India itself. We don't have a readership in India, right? And this is very different for some of my Anglophone colleagues. One of my best friends was Avni Dias from ABC, who was effectively ousted on the eve of the elections. Her work is seen, also seen, by the way. She's a TV presenter, so people have a face with. Is
that Australian broadcaster?
Australian broadcaster.
There's an ABC in America.
Excuse me. Yes, sorry. Yes. ABC, Australia. I would say TV always has it worse than people that hide behind bylines, and also those who make English language content have it far worse, because they have a far stronger readership in India itself. So I would say no, not censorship, but a keen awareness that people know what you read. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the question, whether working has become harder.
You would know.
Yes, it has. I mean, I think, Lisa, you're also subject to the annual review at the ministry, and then there's the envelope which says extension, yes or no, in there. But it's become more harder for. I'm no longer a resident correspondent. I try to visit as often as I can, and I notice from many colleagues, getting a press visa to cover even elections is very difficult. And we're also discussing the issue of complicity here and there, and to what extent other governments around the world play a role in propping up the Modi regime. This is one very clear and particular example where journalists from other countries actually find very little support of their own national governments in terms of pointing this out. So in a way, the press is a little lower in that. And working also has become much harder in the sense that there's just so many less resources available now than previously, because of the stifling of independent media, as we mentioned, but also in terms of purely statistics, facts and figures, the tools that journalists use and academics use, or the public and activists use, to actually have a check on government and to see whether the stories the propaganda that they tell, whether it's actually true. Those resources have deliberately been made much less available over the past 10 years. So it's become, in that sense, very much more difficult. And I think, then addressing also the point Jan Breman just made, that makes reporting on India in a general sense a much more difficult exercise. You're much more groping in the dark, much more. at the same time, the journalists are notoriously bad in predicting elections. I think that's been shown over the past decades quite often. And at the same time, also, I mean, journalism is also not really in the business of predicting elections. I think it's more in the business of really showing what the bid of various campaigns is to the people, and then sort of waiting for the results and see whether those bids have actually been successful or not, and then go and find out why they haven't or why they have been. At the same time, I mean, I think many people have been surprised, and of course not everybody, by I mean, the opposition came out of the previous Indian elections stronger than indeed most people had predicted. And the interesting thing is, it's not even, I think, I don't have the exact math on top of my mind. I mean, the total number of BJP voters hasn't even decreased that much. It's more, it's really the sort of constituency division that has previously maybe very much worked in favor of the BJP alliance, and now in a way more worked against them a little bit. But that's all follow-up issues, I think.
Thanks. Yeah. I think it's useful to highlight the BBC case that you brought up, just to talk about the challenges for international, foreign journalists, foreign media to work in India, because the BBC produces a fantastic documentary called Modi's India, a two-part series, which actually showed nothing really unusual, in the sense that so many Indian journalists and academics had been showing how these riots in 2002 took place, and the complicity of the Modi regime in holding back the police forces and in allowing, the butchering of more than 1,000 people, most of whom were Muslims, in the state of Gujarat, and then also showing what happened to those people that showed that, that showed that the complicity of the regime, the police officers like Sanjeev Bhatt, who were, basically framed in another case, who are now in prison, the lawyers that stood up, the judges that, raised bells suddenly, well, actually, dying, how we don't actually quite know, as justice lawyer. And what was unusual actually about the Modi documentary was the government support, which is actually the UK government. The Foreign Office had a report which had never been brought into the public domain before, which actually showed all of these things. So that was really unusual about that documentary. It showed the UK government's own report on the Modi regime at that time when Modi was chief minister, and verifying all of these things that Indian journalists, authors, writers have been talking about, and foreign writers have been talking about for a long time. And what did they do? They banned, banned this documentary being broadcast in India. Students who were showing it on the campuses, defying the bans, got arrested. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, they basically went and raided the BBC offices in Delhi. The tax authorities suddenly turn up, and they're looking at your paperwork. And this is how actually many media organizations have been silenced. Many journalists have been silenced. Many NGOs, 16,500 NGOs had, these tax laws basically used to raid them and to police them. In the last few years, and what has happened to the BBC? I mean, of course, those also a defamation case was filed against the producers of the BBC in some, I can't remember which court it was. Somebody else in the audience can probably remember. They usually, file these cases in like far corners or far corners of the country. So you have to spend your life, trying to present yourself in these cases, and obviously you can't work anymore, do the important work anymore, and so that was that kind of angle, the legal angle, the tax rates, and then eventually the BBC had to basically, cease operation in its current form in India, and which is something it's never done before, and operate out of a kind of private company. And so, this is, the BBC is being targeted. And we have many journalists in India, obviously, who have been targeted, who have been jailed, as we were talking about the NewsClick people, but also foreign journalists who have had their visas removed. I mean, Vanessa Dunak, who is a friend for 30 years has been living in India, is an OCI, whose husband is an Indian or was married to an Indian national, has a child, raised a child in India, has had to leave India. And the second French journalist who, on the eve of the Indian election, was also had his OCI revoked. And talking about OCIs brings you to actually OCIs, which are these overseas Indian citizenships, which actually many OCIs have been revoked. So people who are speaking out against the regime outside of India who can't go back. And of course, research visas. That's what the research visas being declined left, right, and centre. So that of course leads to policing. Many people deported. Stories we don't hear about, because people would rather keep silent about them. And so this has resulted in an overall intellectual climate, media, research, etc., where there has been the repression, but also be a kind of self-silencing, which takes place under these circumstances. And I think it's important to kind of highlight that, but also the need to keep speaking about these issues and writing against and fighting against.
To that case. An interesting thing that happened around the BBC raid was that within sort of this little community of foreign correspondents, there's a fair few in New Delhi because it serves as the hub for South Asia bureaus. That really felt as the first in a while, at least the first time in a while, that the international press corps was touched by this state apparatus. And what was interesting was that in discussions and in back rooms and in the cafes or whatever, Indian journalists would also tell us, well, you guys actually maybe didn't use the room that you did have for long enough, for a while longer than us, to really speak up as well. Like, you should have maybe been stronger stalwarts yourselves. Ultimately, what do you have to lose? Well, what is it? You go home. And so a fair few of us felt like, oh, shoot, you're right. And so there will always be... Definitely, I want to say, yes, it can be difficult to work as a foreign correspondent in India, but woe is me. Our Indian colleagues have been under far greater duress for much, much longer. Ultimately, what it could mean is you can't go back to India. You go back to the Netherlands and, you set up shop in Islamabad if you're so inclined. That's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think there were some more questions at the back of the room.
I'd love to stay in India, by the way, sorry.
Okay, hi. I'm Akash. I had a bunch of questions, but I think I will boil them down just a few. The first one being, you were talking about the gradual movement of Adivasis, and they have more affiliation to RSS or Hindutva groups because of the schools being set up by RSS. Maybe just a small thing that I wanted to say or ask. Maybe this is stupid, so please stop me if it is, but it's also generally the case, for example, if you look at Tamil Nadu, where there's a general movement of the Brahminical hierarchy being shifted to the OBC hierarchy, because, the Periyar movement, and what ended up happening was it removed the power from the Brahmins, which is, of course, absolutely necessary, but what it ended up doing as an unintended consequence was most of the power is now shifted into the hands of the OBC community in the villages. Of course, still the caste hierarchy exists, I'm not denying that. But the point is, most of the caste atrocities that happen in Tamil Nadu are OBC atrocities inflicted on Adivasis and Dalits. What that ends up doing is the lower caste also assimilate into the Hindu fold, because, of course, caste is not just two separate blocks, right? It's a continuous spectrum of hierarchy and continuous oppression. So, of course, when you have someone else to oppress, you would want that system to exist, so you yourself don't get folded. So that my first question is, maybe it's is it not just the fact that RSS schools are being set up, but also the fact that people naturally want to be included into the fold? That's my first question. And the second question was about the point about Arundhati Roy. I've partially read a few of her works, but recently there was a slight controversy in which I think she referred to herself as a black person. in a book to make a point. I think it was Utmost Happiness, I think, but a lot of people were quite alarmed by it, I think. My point is, in a lot of the books I find, they seem to somehow romanticize victimhood in the sense that portraying Dalit people or minorities in this light of, I don't know how to say it exactly, but essentially I think the perfect word that describes it is romanticizing. But does that really help in the sense that all that kind of perpetuates is that shows that, oh, okay, these people are victims, and this paints them in the light of victims, but that doesn't really help the cause in the particular way that, I think the story told by the people who are victims, right? That's my entire baseline point. My third point is, okay, sorry, yeah.
Well, we can get back. And also remember there's some drinks at the end in which you can try and pose your questions directly.
Hi, my name is Iftikhar. I have just one question from the, when you, currently there is a whole discussion going on decolonization in the academy also, and you see in the movements, particularly in the Global South, various movements have kind of very neat connection with the colonial setup also. It's like somehow it comes up there. Like, for example, the state where I come from, the Kashmir, also has in some part has a British colonialism played up a role, and also in Manipur, also in currently what is happening also, and these movements has a somewhat you look critically at them, but then you kind of stop at somewhere and see how to engage with it. Then it's I don't know. I'm just asking this question. The second, I'm just have a kind of just a response to it that about the New Delhi. When you live in the New Delhi or Mumbai or any big city in India, you don't see much of the India actually. The problem is that New Delhi is such a big place. It's almost two Netherlands in terms of population, and you find numerous stories there. You don't need to go outside anywhere, so you don't know what's going on anywhere else. For me, traveling 5 hours to Germany is just like, okay, I'll go there and come back. So it's just nothing big deal. But that comes from the context where you see in the Europe, cities are small, and that context plays into the head that, oh, I didn't see a lot of things changing. There, nothing much is happening. I mean, and New Delhi is a big place, but in the same time, the media in Kashmir actually just gone nowhere. It doesn't exist anymore, yeah. and many other medias.
Thank you, Arati.
Hi, my name is Arati. My question is how the case of Kabir Kalamanj is different from this case, because they were already arrested. First time they were arrested during Congress rule, 4 of them, under UAPA, and they were released on bail for 4 years, and then again they were arrested in relation to Yalgar Parishad and Bhima Koregaon case. So during Congress rule, how it was different and how BJP was involved, RSS was involved at that time. Okay, thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Last question.
Thank you. Based on what we see, what's happening in India, it seems like they are projecting the Hindutva agenda. And if I look in that context, then it seems like it's not an isolated event, especially the Bhima Koregaon. But then I wonder, like, especially the people in academia coming from the dominant caste, or the activists, so-called, the way they approach these challenges, or the pretending to be the heroes or saviors of the oppressed communities in India. So my question is, like, when they're gonna stop doing that and give the stage to the people coming from those oppressed people, and then when people will actually go back to their own communities and educate them, instead of going to the oppressed people and telling them you're oppressed, instead of going back to their oppressor and say, hey, you're doing this wrong, we should not be doing this. I think that would be more effective strategy. I would like you to reflect on this.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
A mix of critical questions.
They're all brilliant questions. Thank you so much for them. And I think let's try and kind of address a number of them together in different ways. Your question about the Kabir Kala Manch is actually really interesting, and it ties back to a question that was raised earlier, but we didn't have a chance to answer, about democracy and whether this is an elite project, and also it ties to your question about the people, the intellectuals who've been given space. And I think that what's interesting about the BK16 case is how many of them came from Dalit backgrounds, who came from who came from marginalized sections of society, and basically it's these people who were incarcerated in this case. And what we've been trying to highlight, is basically they have been silenced. So it's up to us to showcase their work and to show how important it is. So a lot of my book charts why people like Anantal Tunde, the Dalit professor, is so important, not just for India, but for the world. Why we need to be reading voices like Anantal Tunde, why we need to be paying attention to what the Dalit lawyer Surendra Gadling was doing in the state of Maharashtra. When these people are incarcerated, when they cannot, it's like very important to be telling their stories. I just got a message from Anantal Tunde on my phone today, he's, maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but who is basically, it's very important for them that these stories get told. And what they see, what I think is unusual and important about the people who have been incarcerated in this case, is how they're arguing not on an identity-based politics, that only a Dalit has a right to argue for a Dalit, but that they are saying that we need to unite forces at this moment in time. Dalits, Adivasis, upper caste, what we need is a project which basically challenges the structures which are oppressing us, which is the forces of the state, the forces of the ways in which caste operates, the ways in which a collusion is taking place between global capital and Hindutva forces. So I think what I take, for me, what's really important, what I've learned through writing this book, is what the message of their work is. And to me, this is real decolonial scholarship. Now, they would never use the word decolonial, going back to your question about Kashmir, and they would never use the word decolonial to talk about their work. Why wouldn't they do that? They wouldn't use the word decolonial because decolonization has been hijacked by the Hindu authoritarian regime. They are claiming that we are the first decolonial state. Modi is going to be the first decolonial prime minister. After 1,000 years, we are now going to finally decolonize India. Forget what the British did in India, but let's look at all the history of Mughal rule over India. So it's like, in the Indian context, and I don't believe India is unique to this. This is decolonization has become a very powerful word of the fascist authoritarian right, and we need to basically be challenging this use of decolonization. And showing actually what does decolonization today in India mean. And I think to me, the BK16 have really taught me that what it means is basically a cross-caste, cross-class alliance against the forces of capital, of state, and of course in this case, the rise of a very right-wing regime. So there is a whole chapter on Kashmir, by the way, in the book, told through the story of Gautam Navlakha. I think you'll find it really interesting because it talks about the repression of Kashmiri activists and what the struggle of Kashmir has meant to India and why it's really important. And about democracy, this bit links back. The Kabir Kala Manch they were arrested before under the UAPA. Yes, Vernon Gonzalez, Arun Farena were arrested before under the UAPA. What is really important to me about these activists is that for them, fighting for democracy on the ground meant fighting whatever regime was in power, because actually the structures of oppression and inequalities look the same in many places, no matter what regime is in power. Of course, they had a particular focus on the rise of the Hindu right as well in the last decades of their life. But, democracy was of course, it was an elite idea in a certain way in the country, right? But it has had deep roots in the country. It has reached far corners of the country. There has been a long, battle for it. And the BK16 and others like them have been fighting for these democratic rights beyond elections, and so I think it is not just, an elite project. I take what you say about Arundhati Roy, that I was one of her first critiques. I wrote a whole piece called, Eco-Incarceration, which was about her book Walking with the Comrades, which painted these Adivasis as being, this Adivasis taking up arms as being this lovely movement of indigenous people taking up arms against mining corporations, which to me stripped the politics out of the movement, which stripped the cross-class alliances that were taking shape in the jungles of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, So I completely take your point, but that's a separate issue. In this moment in time, what is happening to her is also part of our broader analysis of what is happening in the country at large. Whether you agree with her or not on particular points of her writing is a separate matter. Yes, it's important to have our critical analysis of all of us. I depend on my colleagues for a critical analysis of my work, but that is separate to, about what is our analysis of what's happening to her at this particular moment in time and what it says about the country at large. And you're completely right about processes of Sanskritization, especially amongst Dalits, which, M.N. Srinivas wrote about a long time ago, which have enabled the rise of Hindutva forces within many of these areas where actually, so it's not just the schools, of course not, it's a range of different things so Dalits who want to kind of basically become proper Hindus. It's coming internally, not just externally, of course. In Adivasi areas, I think it is slightly different because, you really had like spaces and people who had, really tried to step away from the forces of the state, who had countercultural movements, even different ideas of democracy entirely on the ground. And there, I think the schools have been extremely powerful. They've been one of the main important things. And you see this in the election results. Across the tribal belts, the BJP has actually, gained ground in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh. It's gained ground. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can some continuing discussion coming up here, but I think these are very important points to end it with here. Of course, you're very welcome to stay for drinks and continue the discussion. I want to thank the audience for all the excellent questions, Lisa and Casper for your very interesting insights, and of course, Alpa for your book and your presentation. Thank you very much.